It hit Time magazine and what was called the secret killer. Chronic inflammation was really spectacular because we thought that every disease had different pathology. Diabetes is definitely different than cancer. It's different from Alzheimer's. So saying that there might be some common mechanism behind a lot of diseases was very surprising. The secret link to neurological diseases, metabolic diseases, and all that, what was called the secret killer.
Jesper Eugen Olsen, PhD, is a biochemist and biomarker scientist whose research has advanced how we measure chronic, systemic inflammation and its links to disease risk and biological aging. He serves as Chief Scientific Officer at ViroGates and is widely known for his work on SUPAR, a stable plasma biomarker used internationally for risk stratification and prognosis, and increasingly studied in relation to aging and long-term health outcomes.
With hundreds of peer-reviewed publications across inflammation, internal medicine, and prognostic science, his work has helped shape how clinicians and researchers quantify inflammation-driven biological risk and health span.
What makes people successful? What's the influence of genetics? IQ and self-control are independent of each other. You can actually have a rather low IQ and a high self-control, and you will actually be very successful in life. The classic, the marshmallow, and if you don't eat it, you'll get another one. But self-control means really a lot in life. It's really one of the most important. I'm not surprised it's one of the most important factors for success. So the more chronic inflammation, the faster you age. The more SUPAR you have, the faster your brain is aging.
Jesper, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I used the SUPAR biological age at my bootcamp, and I could see 3 to 4 months after, several people had reversed their biological age despite being younger already when they started. But what is biological age?
That's a big question. I guess it's also a very simple question. Biological age is what I think it is. It's an age you have that gives you the information of your risk of developing disease or die. So the chronological age, some people get diseases when they're 65, 70 years old. We know we get a lot of diseases there, but people don't age the same way. So with a biological age, I think the purpose of giving a biological age is to give you a risk age. What's actually your risk age? So, and if you're biological younger than your chronological age, the biological age should say that you are in less risk than people at your chronological age in developing risk, in developing disease. And that can be all kinds of diseases, and it can even be, the ultimate endpoint, mortality. But nobody owns the word biological age. And you can get biological age by doing a test on your mobile phone. You can stand on a weight and get your body age. You can do hundreds of biological age tests. And I don't think they all have the same purpose but for me, it should reflect risk. So if I'm older in biological age than my chronological age, I have an increased risk of becoming ill very soon. It could be related to cardiovascular disease. It could be development of type pre-diabetes, getting type 2 diabetes, or I can, even many cancers are predictable, right? So your biological age should predict that. And that's a big discussion. How can we compare all these different, biological age? And you can get a little bit tired of the word because it's just not. Nobody owns it, and everybody can make a biological test. And I made a biological test. I believe my biological test is really good because it's based on a lot of science and knowledge and hundreds of thousands of blood sample measurements over time.
But let's jump into that in a second.
Yeah.
So just say chronological age, that's how many years our normal age.
Yeah.
And I like the other definition that you're giving biological age being the risk factor. Because often people I'm only 16 years old. No, you are still 40.
Yeah.
The classic one is the one in the weight, where people get told that they're really young, which is from my understanding, not very accurate.
Well, it depends on what it's supposed to say, but so I guess people can have different ideas of what a biological. It can be a body biological age, but maybe they say it's nothing to do with the risk of disease. But for me, a biological age should reflect risk of disease.
And risk of disease is because we know when we're getting older, there's a much higher risk that we're getting different diseases, which is also like the whole Dave Sinclair saying that aging might be a disease that we need to cure because when we get older, we get more sick.
Well, that's a very, very big discussion, actually. It seems like a very simple question you're asking me. Is aging a disease? And, or is aging not a disease? And I think, you can make many podcasts with a lot of brilliant people talking about that, and they will not agree. I was to a conference last year at what's called the Doc Conference in Napa Valley in the USA, and we actually used a whole evening to discuss it. And there are very different opinions about it. There were some really heavy investors there. They really want aging to be a disease. They say, look what happened to Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. When was it, 8 years ago? Obesity became a disease. So suddenly you got obesity as a disease, meaning that a lot of people would develop drugs, put money in it because it's treatment of a disease. And the FDA will not approve anti-aging drugs because aging is not a disease. It's not recognized today as a disease. It's a risk factor. We can agree on that, but it's not a disease. And because it's not a disease, you cannot develop pharmacological interventions. And nobody will put money in it. So the argument, the discussion is, come on, we are all the scientists in the room, let's argue for, is it a disease or is it not? And there's no agreement. There's a lot of agreement that it's a risk factor, but so you're 80 years old, you're not suffering for anything. Are you now, do I give you an ICD-10 disease code because you're old, right? That's the implication of making aging a disease, that we have to come up with some kind of, so when are you diseased? So at the moment, the FDA has not recognized aging as a disease, and if they did, it would definitely change the whole game of longevity medicine. But now that we're talking about, longevity medicine, I would like to bring up that it's really interesting that many of the recognized drugs we already know, we just talked about FDA approving obesity as a disease some year. I don't exactly remember when it was, but it changed the whole game. And it changed the game for obesity drugs and all that. And we know all GLP-1. It's particularly here in Denmark where we have Novo Nordisk as our biggest company in our little country. And last week I was at the Aging Research and Drug Development Conference in Copenhagen, ARDD, a 5-day-long conference at the University of Copenhagen, arranged by Morten Scheiby Knudsen and others. A really excellent conference where I think 65 of the top 100 researchers in aging were present that week. Really excellent. And what was really surprising was that you had Lotte Bjerre Knudsen from Novo Nordisk for the first time saying that GLP-1, what we call Wegovy, that GLP-1 was a longevity drug. That's a very, very big statement for a very conservative, very big drug company to come out and say, because that, when they officially say, and she was the one who developed GLP-1, and she has a very high position in Novo Nordisk. So by her saying that, it changes the game. It doesn't mean that, what does that mean? That maybe we don't need to have aging classified as a disease, but we can maybe still classify longevity as something, or health span, or at least when you go out and claim. So what's the implications of claiming that GLP-1 is a longevity medicine? It is probably that you will take it from treating obesity to treating people like you. You're maybe too young, but you are, well trained. You don't have any excess fat on your body, right? So it means that you take the market from obesity to everybody, right? So it's interesting. it's an interesting statement to come with during a conference, I think.
But what do you think it takes for FDA to recognize aging as a disease? Like, what needs to be the shift? A lot of
It's a good, what do you think? I mean, do you think, aging is a disease?
I like the thought that it's a disease that I can live a lot longer and feel healthy.
And when should I then claim you to be ill because you have reached a certain age?
That's a good question. And I guess that's also what they are sitting and looking at. So they might want to recognize it to a certain extent, but like, where do you set it? Is it 50, 60, 70, 80, 90?
Exactly.
I see how that's harder from that perspective.
Because you classify individuals as a patient, even though they are aging very good, even though they are like this 107-year-old man recently broke a record on bicycle, and now he's a patient.
Yeah.
But because he's old, for that reason alone, right? If it's an ICD-10 as a disease classification code, aging, like
and then there's
obesity
the psychological aspect as well. If we start thinking that we are sick, where that does to our cells and everything, that we're like, oh, I'm sick.
Yeah.
Where that guy that's 107 is probably just feel like, I'm old, I'm lucky.
Yeah.
If he's told that he's sick, and it's an interesting.
But it's now, I never really thought so much about it, but maybe if we can be good enough in determining a very good biological age, we could claim that your biological age was a disease in somehow, because at least it's even stronger. I don't know, aging is very strongly associated with disease. That's why everybody wants to claim aging as a disease. But just because it's correlated with doesn't mean that it is a disease, right? But biological age is even stronger linked to risk of disease. That's what the whole purpose, as we discussed a little bit before, the whole purpose of developing a biological age is to separate the aging risk for disease that we know from the chronological age, saying, oh, now you're 65 years old, and that's when diseases start to come, right?
Is it 65 where we see the...
It's now I've done a lot of epidemiology research and so on, and we typically use 65 as a cutoff for healthy individuals and diseased. I mean, it's a very good...
Okay, because I talked to someone in an insurance company, and they have a ton of health data.
Yeah.
They saw that a lot of women start getting something in their 30s, and men get really hit in their 50s, often with heart problems and so on.
Yeah.
But that's the premiums and so on, so it's different than what you look at the research you're sitting at.
I mean, when we do, let's say, a study on, I've done a lot of work on acute medicine, stuff like that, right? We typically divide patients into below or above 65, because it doesn't mean that below 65 there's no disease. It's just, that's where it really,
So my mom that's 67 and always been healthy, I can now go back to and say like, Mom, now it's really important. You might have been super healthy now, but you're looking into the super increase in risk.
Yeah. And that's why this whole conversation is interesting, right? Because is she really, just because she's 67 years in chronological age, now stepping into the disease area? That's the whole background for longevity and thoughts. So we use, very big studies of thousands of individuals. We come up with 65-year-old, and that's a risk factor. But we know that some people get disease and others don't, right? So maybe your mother is not 67, maybe her biological age is even more, and she's actually, on a risk to becoming, as we have, comorbid, with several comorbidities and chronic diseases. Or she might even be way below the 65, she might be 58 years old. But how do we measure that biological age, Mads? Because that's, the big question, and I think it's an interesting discussion, and you kind of invited me also to discuss that, and it's not that I want to talk all the time, but
let's go into like the different ones. So like there's the weight one, which I haven't met anyone that's a big fan of. You have super, that we're going to talk much more about, and then you have epigenetic ages, and that seems to be kind of the two big ones, and there's like organ markers as well, which I understand is also very related to epigenetic.
Organ clocks, yes.
Yeah. Will you just give like a quick intro to it, and then we're going to dig into some of the data about super and the Dunedin studies and so on, which I find super fascinating. One of the reasons why I used it, and I've recommended many other people to use it.
Yeah. So, chronic inflammation. Everybody talks about chronic inflammation. They talk about anti-inflammatory foods. They talk about lifestyle and chronic inflammation. But actually, we haven't been really good in measuring chronic inflammation. I have, worked on chronic inflammation in a Copenhagen University setting for 28 years, being head of a research group working on chronic inflammation. Had many PhD students, and we've looked into inflammation as a driver of disease. We also worked a lot with acute medical patients to find out, how sick are they? Can we send them home, or they need further treatment? And even should we review the medicine they're getting and stuff like that? So it's risk recognition among individuals. And chronic inflammation is something that wasn't discovered until the 1990s by development of what's today called the high-sensitive CRP assay, C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein, or the infection number, some people call it, or the low-grade inflammation biomarker. It's CRP is something that's produced by our liver when we get bacteria in our body. If we have an infection, we get a lot of it. We go to the doctor, they prick a little hole on our fingers, they take the blood out, and they measure the CRP. And if it's like 100, 200, then we give you antibiotics. But then in the 1990s, somebody developed an assay that was called highly sensitive CRP.
An assay, for people that don't know.
Yeah, it's a way to measure CRP. Before that, you had CRP or you didn't have it. You had very high CRP, you give antibiotics, or you had a CRP of 0. So that was fine. But then somebody developed an assay that could say, oh, it's not 0, it's 0.3, it's 0.8, it's 1.2. We call it a highly sensitive method because the old was just, picking up on very high CRP signals, but it couldn't detect low CRP signals. And with a highly sensitive assay, suddenly everybody, even though they don't have a bacterial infection, even though they are not ill at all, you could measure their CRP in their blood. And I think it hit Time magazine in 1996 as what was called the secret killer. There's this state in the body that is associated with all kinds of diseases. And that was really spectacular because we thought that every disease had different pathology. Diabetes is definitely different than cancer, right? Cardiovascular disease is different from Alzheimer's, neurological diseases. So saying that there might be some common mechanism behind a lot of diseases was very surprising. And it was published as this link, the secret link to neurological diseases, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and all that. And it was amazing. And the first term that came out of this was because it was very low amounts you had. Like you didn't have this high CRP, you need antibiotics. You just had a little bit of CRP, but you have a little bit more than the average population. You had what we called low-grade inflammation. The word was because it was a highly sensitive assay, it was very low. But low-grade inflammation, I changed that now into talk chronic inflammation, because it's not really low as such. But it's the low level, but still elevated is low-grade inflammation, and that's underlying disease. The problem with CRP is it's highly variable. It opened our eyes when you take 10,000 people, you measure their CRP, and you look at those it was like below 1 or between 1 and 3 or above 3, then you could see that those above 3 had more risk of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of certain neurological diseases than those who had below 1. But if you take one individual and measure them every day for the next month, they will be above 1, and then they will be below 1, then they will be above 3. But they might actually, have some, they can be lower and generally can be higher. CRP is a very good protein for population studies, but it's not so good on an individual level because it changes too much. Then you run for the bus and it goes up a little bit, and then you slip maybe bad and it goes. So Monday you have chronic inflammation or low-grade inflammation, and Tuesday you don't, and then Wednesday you have chronic inflammation again. And that's not a good biomarker.
All the people that went clubbing then
Yeah.
Sunday, Monday.
Definitely, and that's maybe also deserved. But we were like scientists. I work with some really good PhD scientists, Thomas Haupt and Line Yi, Hartmann Rasmussen, and many others at Hvidovre Hospital at the clinical research department. And we were wondering, could we find something better? And SUPA, we already worked a bit with in HIV back in the late 90s and did our first publication, finding that if you had HIV and you had this high SUPA, you progressed much quicker to AIDS and death. And we did a really nice publication in Blood in 2000. And I thought, SUPA and HIV was linked together. But then we found out that if you had other infectious diseases and high SUPA, you also died. And then we found out that, the general population in Denmark, that if you had high SUPA but no infectious diseases, you also developed cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and died quicker than people with low SUPA levels. And then we measured SUPA like every 20 minutes for 24 hours in some individuals, and they had to drink Coca-Cola, they had to sit on a bicycle, and they were sleeping, of course, 24. And the SUPA was the same. But other biomarkers, then you wake up, and then you drink Coca-Cola, and then you're on a bicycle, they wake up or down, but SUPA was just straight throughout the day. You don't need to fast. It's not affected, so it's very stable. And if we measure 3,000 Danes, and then 5 years later we measured them again, and there was still a very strong correlation, about 0.6, as a kind of the SUPA you had 5 years ago could change, but it was still linked to so very stable biomarker over time. And that can be very
but
good.
Still with a slow increase over the years.
Yeah, it increases with age. So and that's kind of typical, because what is chronic inflammation, right? A simple explanation I like is that it's a communication, it's a language between cells. It's like right now I'm more inflamed than you because I'm talking all the time. I'm talking, and you're listening. You're the cell, I'm another cell. I'm telling you all these kind of things. Then another guy or a girl comes into the room and she starts talking, and everybody starts talking, and your girlfriend comes home and she says, why is there something in the dishes? And you should have emptied the dishwasher. And then somebody comes in and that's kind of chronic inflammation. You're losing your focus on making this podcast because your girlfriends come in and she shouts at you. And if you imagine that you are among billions of cells in the body, it's kind of the same thing. You're fixing a blood, there's something cancer going on in your body every day. You're fixing that. You're killing the cells that are cancers. You're cleaning your cardiovascular system, your vessels, and everything's nice. Then somebody comes in and shouts, you're in the midst of killing these cancer cells, and the dishwasher, the other cells come and say something is going on. That's inflammation. It's everybody is talking, everything is, this environment, and you stop fixing things. You start, everybody calls wolf, something's going on, and there's not calm, and then we found, this chronic inflammation, it drives a lot of mistakes and risk of disease. So you get all this kind, because your immune system is really important, its function. We found that, if you have a lot of chronic inflammation, everybody is shouting, and you get a virus. Nobody noticed that virus. We saw it during COVID-19, right? People who had high SUPA and they got the virus, they often ended up in mechanical ventilation. People with low SUPA, nobody did. We did some really exciting scientific experiments during COVID and developed a treatment for COVID based on chronic inflammation, which was like the first EMA and FDA approved treatment for treating COVID-19. But the whole idea behind that was also that if you have chronic inflammation, and it doesn't have to be COVID, it can be any virus or bacteria, your resilience is not very good. You become very ill because you don't have a good immune system. And that's interesting also in the field of longevity. So we don't want chronic inflammation. We want a good immune system, right? And we can affect that in many ways. We know people who exercise have lower chronic inflammation. The immune system works better if you eat healthy and all that. And maybe there's actually also drugs that can affect your level of chronic inflammation. So yeah, a lot of, so we learned and we found that SUPER was kind of a good biomarker to measure this chronic inflammation. So I'm together with Line E. Hartmann Rasmussen. She was first author of this review we published a few years ago, where we argue for why we can now measure chronic inflammation using this simple biomarker SUPER.
And you did some pretty big cohorts, as far as I understand. I remember that we'd spoken in 130 Labs about some of the studies you've done. You looked into the Dungy study. If you can tell a little bit more about the Dungy study in New Zealand, what that is, and how you actually correlated the SUPER with that.
Yeah,
I love the simple explanation with the slide that shows SUPER compared to FACE, and you can see and several other things.
Yeah. I call it the Dunedin, but I'm actually not sure. But Dunedin or Dunedin is a city in New Zealand, and there were some really visionary people back in the 60s discussing, what makes people happy in life, what makes people successful, why are some becoming drug addicts and ending up in jail, and others become professors and artists, and what's the influence of genetics? It was kind of before we had the big genetic platforms, right? But we had knowledge since Watson and Crick about genetics. What's the influence of the environment and all that? And how can we determine that? And the problem with every other study, also many that I've done, and you know very well, in Denmark we have something called Østerbro-undersøgelsen, we have Glostrup-undersøgelsen, we have these huge population studies. But population studies, it's something that you're invited to participate in, and you have a selection bias because it's all the people who are, having low chronic inflammation, you could say. They have a e-box, they have a home, if you're homeless and if you are not getting food and, you don't participate, your invitation. But if you are in Dunedin and say, how can we avoid the bias of selection that some people, will participate and some people won't? And they said, what if we have children that are born into the cohort, And so they included all pregnant women in the city of Dunedin for a whole year, and it's their children the Dunedin cohort is following.
How many people were that?
It was around a little more than 1,000 that was born in, 72, 73. And they are now 52 years old. And the interesting thing is that they've been followed so intensively, and we've learned so much about human behavior and human nature, and what I just mentioned, what drives criminality and success and so on in life, right?
I remember we discussed it when I was at Harvard.
Yeah.
I was also looking at that study, and it was about happiness and so on, and what actually makes people happy.
Yeah.
This is one of the studies, right? It's one of the best data sets we have in the world when it comes to looking at humans, right?
Yeah. And what determined whether people become happy?
If I remember it right, it was something about social connections. That was really important.
Yeah.
And then I don't think they called it grit, but I think that came out as well, like the self-control. It was also the title was something about self-control.
Yeah.
So that spoke into having some kind of self-control was extremely important for your happiness. So if you could increase your self-control, then you would have a happier life and have more success.
Yeah, and that's, it's so amazing with the self-control. And I remember one of the heads of the study, Terry Moffat, she thought that IQ would be the most important factor. Then there's happiness, but there's also this, what we determine as success in life. Because happiness is also hard to measure, but you can measure success in many ways, like social income, social status. And in Dunedin, it's every 7 years that they are undergoing very thorough investigations from everything from your economics and interviews of people around you. When you were in kindergarten, they were talking to the kindergarten teacher, but also interviewing other children. And when you were growing up as a teenager, they were very much into the environment. They visited everybody in their home. They noticed also how clean is the home. There's a lot of billions of data. And then today, it's deep sequencing, it's epigenetics, it's many things have come from it. And one of the things that really turned out was actually the self-control. And it turned out, which was interesting to Terry Moffat, this brilliant researcher, was that IQ and self-control are independent of each other. That you can actually, either you could call it happiness, we call it more like success in life, that you can actually have a rather low IQ and a high self-control, and you will actually be very successful in life, or you can have a high IQ, low level of self-control, and you will actually be maybe have a bad life or criminal or something. But it's not that surprising, maybe. You know, everybody talks the classic. When we talk self-control, it's typically the marshmallow. It's something you have very early in childhood. You can take a little child and a grown-up come in and says, here's a marshmallow. I will leave you for 5 minutes, and if you don't eat it, you'll get another one. But if you eat it, you won't get another one, right? And the child will sit there and they will look at it and take it up and smell it. And some children, they, you know, the old one is up, they eat it. They cannot wait, right? And others, they wait, and some even take it up and they start to peel it out from the inside. So it still looks
some hide under the table.
Really clever children. It still looks like, but they ate half of it. But if it's there when they come back, they get rewarded by another one. And that's a simple test for self-control. But self-control means really a lot in life. It's really one of the most important. I'm not surprised it's one of the most important factors for success, right?
And you can improve it. So the class that I had was a long title. The Psychology of Emotional, Behavioral, Motivational Self-Regulation.
Yeah.
Another name for self-control, right?
And what is that? That means just that you're a little bit hungry, you're driving in your car, the McDonald's sign is right there, right? It's your behavioral control so that you say, I'd rather go home and eat my carrots. And, you know, that's kind of self-control. Or you drive in there and you throw all the burgers and the fries and you get fat and that's self-control. It's also when, hey, you want to try this new drug and maybe you say, you know, that's also self-control. There's a lot of how everything in life, self-control is also, you know, I'm going down to exercise, even though I'd rather lie in front of Netflix. It's not important that self-control is a really important factor. It was surprising that it was independent of IQ, I think, that these two things are not connected. So Dunedin cohort have learned us that. It has learned us a lot of things. Also, I think there's more than 1,500, many really high quality publications and high impact journals. And one of the things so every 7 years, we also got in and measured SUPAR at a certain time point. And when they got older, the interest went from childhood, teenage years, and so on. And now the focus in the Dunedin cohort is aging. How are people aging? And it can be determined in many ways, aging. We talked about a little bit biological age. But here they're also determining using CT scans of the brain, the aging brain. We use facial age, as you mentioned. You know, you take very good pictures of people. You have 2 committees of independent raters. One committee don't know how old they are, and they have to guess their age from their black and white picture of the face. And the other one are told how old they are, but so they're all 45. Do they look young or old? Put a cross here. And many more, like how fast can you walk in 5 minutes? How many times can you stand and sit from a chair? All kind of physiological and the MR scanning of the brain and correlate all that with genetics. And we measured SUPAR in all these people, and it turned out that, you know, the more SUPAR you have, the older you look, the faster your brain is aging, your cognitive decline, your ability to walk and all that. It's very strongly correlated with your level of SUPAR, or let me say, your level of chronic inflammation, right? So the more chronic inflammation, the faster you age. I mean, that's actually from the Dunedin cohort that we developed a biological age in SUPAR by knowing what SUPAR is when, according to your age and your sex, you know, it increases with age. And if you have a super in the median of other people, like blood donors in Denmark, then your chronological and biological age is the same. But if you have more chronic inflammation than the average person, then you age faster. We know that from Dunedin cohort, so your biological age will be higher. On the other hand, if you are lower than other people at your age and your sex, you age slower.
And you also had the other study, something about people died 10 years earlier. I remember you showed a graph. I think that was Danish data.
Yeah, that's from a Danish study. Because Dunedin cohort, it's a little more than 1,000 people. The very interesting part of it is that these people were not, they didn't have a choice, but they have a retention rate, as you call it, and more than 95% of those who were born are still part of the study, which is really brilliant by the researchers behind it. But they're only 52 years old, so we cannot really look at mortality yet. We cannot really look at age-related diseases. It's coming now, right? But in Denmark, we have many studies done in the 60s, 70s, 80s for people who were 41, 51, 61, 71, included in population studies, followed over time. We have wonderful registers in Denmark, right? And where we register everything about diseases that you get, the medicine you get, your income, all kind of things, and your mortality, of course, And we could see that the higher SUPAR, the higher the risk of all kind of diseases and mortality in those kinds. So, but that's because you age. Is that because you age faster? I don't know. But yeah, at least it's associated with aging and it's associated with diseases. Yeah.
So what can we do if we have a higher SUPAR? So I think that's the question many people got. Like, okay, they can use it as some kind of, whether we call it a biological age marker, because we can see it's correlated, or whether we just call it a marker that we can use for something that's fairly stable.
Yeah.
What can you then do if it's high?
Yeah. We know a lot of things that works. And it's interesting with biological clocks because I think we discussed a little bit biological clocks and what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to recognize risk. It should be more predictive of your risk of disease than your chronological age. So that should also mean that if you do a lifestyle intervention, the biological clock, which is something that would impact your risk, let's say you live a sedimentary lifestyle and now you pull yourself together, you walk every day, you lose weight, you get up and you fitness and you do muscle, which is, anti-inflammatory myokines when you weight lift and all that. You do all those things that we know are good for your body and will improve your longevity. The biological clock should also reflect it. That's the problem with some biological clocks. I read a paper recently that took 51 randomized control studies where you were looking for either pharmacological or lifestyle interventions that should do something good for you. And you measured 15 epigenetic clocks. We haven't talked about epigenetic clocks, but maybe we should go into that a little bit. But the epigenetic clocks measured before and after an intervention, and many of them showed no effect of the intervention. Some do. Some are good in discovering interventions and some do not. And I think you have to look at what an epigenetic clock is to understand. So an epigenetic clock is, so we are born, egg and the semen and the first cell, and it becomes 2 cells and 4 cells, 8 cells, 16 cells, and then we grow into individuals. Some cells end up in the liver, some in the brain, some in your toes, right? And that's a differentiation of cells. But, every cell have the potential to start all over. We saw that from a long time ago with the sheep Dolly, right? It took a little bit of the skin and you can make a clone. You can reverse all the regulation of the cell. But epigenetics is really a layer upon your genetics that regulates whether your genes are expressed or not. So in your liver or your brain or your toe, it's the same genes are present everywhere, but it's not the same genes that are active. Some are closed down, some are turned on. Epigenetics is the science of turning up and down. And it's quite simple. It's like a simple molecule, C3 hydrogen, methylation on C's and G's in the genome, CPGs. So that can turn on. It's a little tag that you put on a gene that can turn the gene on or can turn the gene off. And that's part of the evolution. Now, this guy, Steve Howard, he found that as we age, the more epigenetics, the more regulation, the more CBGs are put on our gene, which is really an amazing discovery, I think. It's just amazing. And it's not only humans, it's all animals, right? And what does that mean? It means that you come home to your apartment, there's been a break-in, right? We know from, if you find a hair, you can find out the sex and you can find out a little bit about the person. And if it's in a database, you can actually find the person. But by epigenetics, you can add a new layer to that. You can actually, within 2.5, 3 years range, you can find the age of the person. So precise. It's like you have your age up the y-axis and you have the methylation out the x-axis, and it's almost like a line. And Steve Howard, he tried to say you must remember there are millions and millions of epigenetic tags in our genome. But he said, are there some that are linked to the chronological age? And that was the first version of epigenetic clocks. But then people started to interest themselves for can they be used to determine a biological age? What if it's not on the line? What if it's above the line or below the line? And then we have second generation, third generation. Yeah, we're talking.
Still have time.
So, and the next generations, they say, let's screen. So let's say you have a cohort of people. I mean, like you have 1,000 individuals. We follow them a long time. Some of them died, some of them didn't die. Now, are there any differences 15 years ago in the epigenetics? And you can, from the millions, you can say, oh, here's one that's not in those who died, one CBG, and here's one that is in those who died, right? That's how grim age was affected. They also put in, like, if you smoke a lot, are there things in there? Of course, we know smoking.
And to say grim age is a horrible name. It's not that you have a grim aging or anything else. It's probably like short or something.
Yeah. Yeah, what is it? It is. It's. I forgot.
But you just hear the name grim age and it sounds like, okay, that's not good.
Yeah, and that was the first really good clock developed for prediction of mortality, right? So they looked at people who died and didn't. So basically, you take an Illumina chip, you do 450,000 CBGs, and then you try to see you have some endpoint. Is there a difference in that? Smokers, do they have a difference, or not smokers? People who die. So that's the third generation clocks. Now, this paper that I mentioned, they looked at 51 randomized controlled trials. They did 15 epigenetic clocks, and many of them don't respond. That's a problem. It's a little bit when you ride a car. If you look at the chronometer, I mean, how far have the car been driving? Epigenetics, excellent for that. It really shows, how far it's driven 100,000 miles, 100,000 kilometers, right? And that's what it says there. But then you have the other thing, which is the speedometer. How far are you driving right now, right? And these two things are independent of each other. And what I would say is that it's very hard to change the chronometer. The epigenetic tests are really showing how far the car is driving, but it's not so good in showing the speed you're driving with right now. It's clear that the faster you drive, the more miles will be put on it, right? And that randomized control trial showed that some epigenetic clocks, even though you live more healthy, they don't change. It's so hard in coil in your genome, these methylations, that they don't just change when you start eating broccoli. The whole history of your life is there. So they're not very responsive to intervention, so many of them are not. Some of them, Dunedin PACE, which also is built on the Dunedin cohort, is actually quite responsive to some of these lifestyle changes, and it is my favorite epigenetic clock, while others don't respond at all. And I think the chronic inflammation test, the SUPAR-H or inflammation test, as I call it, it also captures things to life. We know from studies that if you're 18-year-old and you had adverse events in childhood, you already have more SUPAR, more chronic inflammation on your path to a shorter life. So it also catches things through life, how you live your life. Smokers have more SUPAR and so on. But when you stop smoking, or if you change life, it actually changes. So it's between a chronometer and a speedometer. It gives you how old are you, it increases with age, but it also responds. But we need more science to say, what is best? Should I do this biological clock? Should I do this? I want to do a study where we have like thousands of individuals. We measure all the different clocks and we have follow-up for mortality. Then we determine the biological age, and then we see how good are the biological age in predicting the outcome. And that's something that I want to do that, and let's hope we can get to that.
How much money would that study cost?
I don't think if you do, in an academic scientific world where we are doing this for, we don't think about money that much. It will cost some money to do the test, and we'll ask for some foundations to do the test, and it will take a lot of time. But it will come. I don't know how much money. Maybe a couple of million Danish kroner, $500,000. It depends a little bit on the cohort and the access to the samples, the time. There's some cost in doing all the assays, but it's not impossible. It's not, no.
But I was interviewing another researcher. He looks into psychedelics and mental health. So he was also looking at like the research he would love to do about anxiety and so on, right? And often the challenge is just it costs money to do research.
Yeah.
But you think you would be able to do that kind of study with 1 to 5 million Danish crowns? So someone is sitting and listening.
It's mostly a question, I spoke to Steve Horvath last week and had a good discussion. I was to a dinner with him, and he also recognizes a lot of limitations with the biological epigenetic clocks and their response.
I just want to say a word on that. I think because there's all the marketing hype, and then there's the researchers behind like you and Steve. And when people hear the marketing, it can sound very black and white, or like this is just a perfect, it's good for everything.
Yeah.
And then when you talk to the researchers, it's like, oh, there's all of these things it cannot do. It's good at this, but then you kind of get the nuances as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and none of these, it's kind of a lottery. It's if you're a gambler, we would say what we do is odds, right? We give you odds in a way, right? It's how many tickets do you have in the lottery? And we all know that if we don't exercise and we smoke a lot, we have a lot of, you draw the wrong one, right? And what we're doing is we're determining odds from different biological clocks, but we need to compare how good how exact are we at the different, and maybe even we can combine some of them to get the perfect. But I don't know, for me, I'll rather ask you that, because now we're becoming philosophical, right? Is it all about living long time, right? We're going into this trend. Nobody knew what longevity was 5 years ago. Now everybody wants to, I want to live so long. And they also use a lot of energy and money and NAD and, rapamycin, GLP-1 and all kind of things.
I thought about it yesterday.
Yeah.
How much effort is being spent on living 5 more good years? Like, have you spent more than 5 years to live those 5 extra years, right? So for me, there's the whole health span, lifespan. Like, I don't want to live long sick, but I really do care about living healthy as long as possible, right? Yeah. But it is a big question of like, I see many of the biohackers sometimes sacrificing, where the social aspect is so important. At the same time, we also just got a world that's so sick. Like, people are committing a slow suicide with the way they're living. And like alcohol, you have to justify. It's the only drug you have to justify why you're not taking it. And so we have many things where the default now just is that you're almost fanatic if you eat real food. Like, you're on a diet if you just don't eat processed food, right? So I think our society has drifted so much, but I also think there's one extreme where people are so focused on living long instead of having a good life.
Yeah, and that's also a very interesting discussion, the quality and the quantity of life. But many of the good things in a good life that actually makes you live longer are associated. We did a study, for instance, on social interaction and having a good social life. We could actually measure that in chronic inflammation, right? And that it's good for you. It's very hard to define, though. One thing is living alone, but we also had this Dunedin cohort and a twin cohort from England and a lot of acute medical patients in Denmark. And if you live alone, you have more chronic inflammation, older biological age, than people who live in a family. But if you can also live in a family and be lonely, loneliness and living alone is not the same.
No.
Some people are actually very good in living alone and healthy, and it's very... Yeah, but it's up in the time, do we want to spend 7 years running for living 5 years longer? Then you have to enjoy running at least, right? If you do it only for your longevity, And it's funny, I think, was it you or no? I think it was Rasmus Houlin, you know Rasmus Houlin, right? And he was kind of feeling bad because, he wants to live by this really strict longevity way and really optimize everything in his life. And he'd been out yesterday and drinking some wine and dinners and got a little bit late to bed, right? And then, and then he blames himself, and I had to comment and say, social interaction and good life, and it actually makes you live longer. We kind of studied that, right? It's actually good for you. You cannot go you have to find this balance in life, right? Where we find something that makes us happy, relations, maybe to other people, family, satisfaction with ourselves, a form of self-control, but also, I think sometimes we appreciate too little of what we have right now until we lose it, right? We take it just for granted. I was thinking about when I was driving here, it was piss raining outside, right? And I was almost like singing in the rain because my kids are doing good and my exes are doing good and my friends are doing good. And actually, a lot of things are working right now, but normally you just, I got to be there, now I got to do this podcast, and then I have this meeting afterwards, right? But it's actually, there's a lot of things that in maybe 5 years I'll look back and say, it was so great, and maybe I lost somebody I really loved or something like that, right? We have to stop sometimes.
But we also know gratitude and happiness is extremely important for longevity. I know there's some good studies on nuns because they live very similar as well, where you could see like the nuns earlier that were more happy.
Okay.
They lived longer.
Yeah.
And they have a very similar lifestyle. Of course, you could say, well, the ones that were more happy, were they more healthy, better positions and so on. But still you have people living very similar life, same diet and same kind of work routines, right?
Yeah.
So it is important.
It's very important. People who complain all the time and, about their health or about other people, they die. It's definitely well known. You don't get to be 100 years old unless you see life in some kind of positive, and it's really interesting that it plays such a huge role in how old we become, right?
Yeah. If we jump into some quick fire questions, longevity, overrated, underrated. What are some of the things that you think are highly overrated? We just talked about happiness, positive output, that's underrated.
Yeah.
What's overrated? And then we're going to go back to underrated again.
Overrated is probably many of the supplements some people won't like, but there's a lot of things we don't have any scientific evidence for. There's sometimes, there comes a nice study out, it shows this is maybe good for you, and then people start taking it, but what about is it actually taken into your gut? Is it presented the right way to the cells, intracellular? Is it actually going in as part of the mechanism and so on? And some people, I think, use a lot of money on all kind of things that might be good, and I guess that's why they do it. But as a scientist, I would like sometimes I think it's overrated. I'm also tempted myself, and I also do take certain things, right? But some are more proven than others. Like vitamin D is definitely a good thing to take, right? We know that.
We can kind of say spermidine, ficitine, potentially a bit overrated. Vitamin D, underrated.
Yeah. And it's interesting with ficitine because it's a senolytica. Senolytic cells are also, very much part of chronic inflammation. They have this secretory phenotype that causes. So how senescent cells and chronic inflammation and the SASP. Some people say what is actually, worst of these two, but ficitine is a senolytica that's supposed to kill these old zombie kind of cells that pollute the environment by shouting out and not making any purpose anymore. And ficitine is supposed to kill them. And then I love, again, my favorite scientist is my old PhD student, Line J. Hartmann Rasmussen, who went to Duke and worked on the Dunedin and SUPAR. And she's doing a very big study now with Juliette Trevenier on ficitine, and it's very well controlled. It's big, it's different ages, it's followed over time. And the end point is whether SUPAR is lowered, it's randomized controlled trial. Because SUPAR is part of the SASP, the secretory phenotype of senescent cells. So if you kill the senescent cells, you will also expect lower SUPAR, and you're also supposed to, if you are supposed to live longer because of ficitine or quercetin or many of the other senolytica, then you should also see a slowing in the pace of aging. And, the lower the suPAR, the slower the pace of aging. So the primary endpoint is whether Fisetin lowers the suPAR level. So it goes, and then that goes from right now maybe overrated, let's do the science, and let's see if it works, right? And then I will take it. I won't take it yet. I would like to see the result. It might be working, and then everybody said, I told you so, but let's see the science.
Metformin, overrated or underrated?
It really depends on people you ask. I was just with this, Nia Pasil, who's very dedicated to metformin, and some people are very dedicated to it.
I heard that Dave Sinclair, which has really been promoting metformin, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago that I heard him in a little clip where he actually said he changed to berberine, which I heard many people talk about many years ago, saying like, don't take metformin, there's the side effects, not for everyone, take berberine instead.
Yeah.
Have you seen that trend as well go in that direction, or?
No. I actually, last year at ARDD, there was this Danish PhD student presenting data meta-analysis on metformin and in front of these, aging researchers, and he said there's no effect. And near this really famous scientist taking metformin and done many of the trials stood up and said, that's scientific nonsense, or you're lying, and it was really a dramatic moment, right? But the feelings are really hard in that area. But I think some people know more about metformin than I. I'm not one who's going to take it, that's for sure right now. But there are other drugs that I do take.
What do you personally take, Jesper? Because I know your journey is very tied up to suPAR. You used to, I'm not sure if you're smoking now, it depends. It used to depend on whether your suPAR value was saying something, right?
Yeah, it's always bad to smoke. I mean, it doesn't really, we did a study following more than 1,000 smokers for 14 years, and if you have low suPAR and you're smoking, you have low risk of developing lung cancer. If you have high suPAR and smoking, you're much more risk, right? Already in your 40s, you get lung cancer. But it's bad for everything. I mean, smoking. I don't smoke right now. I love nicotine though, but nicotine doesn't affect your chronic inflammation. So I take chewing gum and so. But yeah, I fall in sometimes, and then I can just see it on my chronic inflammation that it goes up, and and then I know I'm aging faster, my skin is aging faster, my facial age is going up. I'm 61 years old, so it's about time to stop, and I have stopped, so I stopped.
What do you personally take?
I take fish oil and vitamin D. And then but I'm not only a very good scientist apparently, because I also take microdose GLP-1 or lower than normal dose, and testosterone. Yeah, these two. Yeah.
So testosterone.
But it's like kind of an experiment on my body, getting 61 years old, and then I combine it with strength exercise, working out in the gym, and the GLP-1. That was why it was so interesting for me to say it's a longevity trial. But we've seen for a long time that the lower risk of kidney diseases and of cardiovascular diseases is really, and Alzheimer's recently, right? Neurological diseases. And maybe I see it a little bit as we've known for a long time that the most efficient longevity trick at all, there's nothing that compares to it, is calorie restriction. Right? If you look at mice, don't give them any food, they live 30% longer. So, and GLP-1, that might be part of the effect of it, right? So I use like a low dose, but yeah, and it's not, I don't suggest anybody should do that, because it's not really scientifically proven, because I'm not overweight.
Yeah. But we also see side effects with GLP-1. I saw something with Mike Hyman the other day.
Yes, every time you do something, you take drugs as side effects, right? Yeah. There is side effects by GLP-1.
Yeah.
But it's always...
pros and cons.
Yeah.
And then it's figuring out with your biology, are you more likely to be hit by the side effects with your health profile, or are you less likely, right?
Yeah. I love the effect of it, actually, not feeling hungry, eating less, but you lose muscle weight, and I was low on testosterone. I mean, I was kind of almost, very low. So I also supplement with that. And also then, in order to not lose the muscle mass, I use testosterone.
Yeah.
And because GLP-1 will eat my muscles.
Yes, and which is one of the critiques of GLP-1s is that you lose not only fat, you lose muscles, which can be a problem, especially.
Yeah. So, So that's why there's no way around exercising.
Yes.
And so that's what I do. But I will not advise anybody to do that because it's not proven yet. It's just maybe even stupid.
But as a scientist, sometimes you have to be your own guinea pig.
Yeah. And scientists do all kind of things. You ask them, they all do something. They read a lot of studies and they see, that seems pretty smart. Yeah, so but it's vitamin D and fish oil omega-3. It's very well known. You can see Cell papers on the signal transduction of omega-3 and it's linked to chronic inflammation. Yeah. We know it. It's very safe. You can eat fish. You don't have to take supplements. Just eat some fat fish and stuff like that. Yeah. And vitamin D, you can get sun, but it's very simple. And I don't know if there's any side effects, but many studies have shown. So there's a lot of hardcore evidence, and then there's a lot in between. And I understand why some people try. And we all have our little things we want to try, and we can feel it. But I love to do scientific studies, get 1,000 people to eat it and 1,000 not, and do a placebo control, and let's see what happens. That's the power of science.
Time is running, Jesper.
Okay.
What did I not get to ask you? Or anything you want to finish off telling the listeners?
No, it was some good questions. Overrated, underrated, that's a funny one also, right?
So one that's very much up in the time right now is cold exposure.
Yeah.
It's had a time where people were like, it's amazing, and now it's starting to get a lot of critique.
Okay. Yeah, I was, doing some work with Innersize and Bjørn Hansen and some of these Danish. Personally, I was, in the Royal Danish Lifeguards during a very cold winter period in 83 outside for a long time. And I froze so much that I really can't do it. I think I have, no girlfriends who do it every day in the year, and I can see how they just love it. I think it's a little bit like we talked about before. If you find pleasure in it, but if you do it, jump in the ocean in the winter and you hate it, I wouldn't do it. No. But if you feel it gives you joy and well-being, I think it's good for you.
That goes back again to there's certain interventions we can do. Some might not be that pleasant, but we could start by doing some of the ones that we actually get joy out of. So with movement, find the form that you actually like, instead of looking like, is HIIT the most effective right now according to some papers? Like, what's the stuff you actually do? And it might be the dancing, then you're seeing friends, so you get the social aspect, which was not measured in the studies about the most effective. Yeah. We do know, though, you need to have some kind of strength, movement or something, resistance training and so on. But what's the most fun way, is it? Yeah.
And then bringing people together. I know some of the work that you do, and I think it's really important. And I think it's very good for people because you bring them together. You do something that we know are good for them, but they will all find individual ways to carry it through. Some will, if you do ice bathing, some will maybe keep that up. And if they feel good about it, I think the science is quite proven that it is good for you. It's actually, you need these kind of stressors of your immune system. And it makes it stronger, right? Starvation is also a stressor and all that. And then bringing people together, we talked about chronic inflammation and social life, right? And then I think you also grow as humans sometimes with these men groups and whatever we have in Denmark, and that we need sometimes. And I think that will actually affect both our longevity and our well-being, because it's very connected. If we feel good and if we get some good life hacks that brings us joy, then we will probably have a better life. And I think, I don't think we will have a long lifespan right now, but we can probably have a better health span at least, right? And that might affect the lifespan, but it's about having a good life. So you should find things that makes you happy. And if you're in your psychological state where you're not in the right place of life, I think you should find some other people and friends and men and do something with. and try out some hacks, and some might work for you and some won't.
So, and Jesper, we could talk for many hours. We often do.
Yeah.
So, thank you for coming by today. I'll make sure to link in the show notes and everything else so people can find about you, Super, some of all your research. And if someone is sitting with a ton of money and they want to be interested in being part of a big scientific study about biological aging, they should also reach out.
I should just end by saying also, that I'm the CSO of Virogate, and I have patents on Super. And we are a listed company on the stock market, only selling Super, right? So I have a lot of commercial interest.
Yeah, that will be in the intro as well.
All right, thank you.